Alrighty, welcome back to Freedom Papers, people. It's Morgan Zegers. I'm a contributor to Turning Point, and now I host this super fun history nerd podcast called Freedom Papers, where we evaluate the documents that changed human history. The Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, basically the great debate on should we ratify the U.S. Constitution or not. Guess what? We ended up ratifying it, okay? Very cool thing. Very, very wise thing to do, if you ask me. Now, today, we have a very special guest, but we gotta do the history learning first before we bring him on in. So the first part of this episode is going to be talking about the history and the information that you need to know about Federalist Paper number 29. It's called Concerning the Militia, and it was written by Alexander Hamilton, but of course, you guys should know by now, it's under the pen name Publius. Now, I will say Publius is such a strange name, but it has a great meaning, and I talked about it in episode 1, so you better go learn more about it if you haven't watched that episode yet. Here's the thing. This is a tricky one, okay? Concerning the militia, there's multiple papers concerning the militia and talking about the military. This one, though, is specifically about federal control over state militias, so the National Guard. What happened is a lot changed over American history from when this original debate between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists occurred during the ratification debate when they're talking about what the role should be with the federal government and the militias. A lot happened, and so I want to give you guys the background, and then we're going to bring on Congressman Paul Gosar, the congressman for Arizona's 4th Congressional District. He is killer. He is a very wise man, and he brings back the true meaning of statesman. He is a statesman who serves his people, and this is so funny, he's kind of like me. He gets super excited about the time that he gets to go and debate people on Capitol Hill, even the debates in the House Freedom Caucus. So we talk all about kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and I can't wait for you to hear it. You've got to stay tuned. But the topics before we come on with him. First of all, we're going to talk about what the Anti-Federalists were saying and what the Federalists were saying on the militia control with state or federal control. Then we're going to talk a little bit about just understanding the militias. And so I want to give you a quick brief on Title 32 versus Title 10. You're going to learn more about that. I'll explain. Then we're going to do a deeper evaluation of what's been going on with using the military domestically. And then we'll get right into our conversation with Congressman Gosar, who was so gracious in giving us 30 minutes. He filmed in Washington, D.C. super late at night, and I'm just very thankful that he would take the time. Let's get into it, though, you guys. So first, the Constitution empowers the Union to, quote, provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving the states respectively to the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So one of the things that Hamilton does in Paper 29 to talk about this is suggest how the federal government should regulate the militia. So it's a little basic at first. He says most of the militiamen should come together once a year to make sure that they are armed and equipped properly just in case they're ever needed. But then he says that in addition to that, a select force of more highly trained and capable people should stand ready to be there for anything that might need a quick response to defend the people. Okay, so just in case, a special force. And it's kind of fun. Now we have special forces. Okay, but they don't exactly do that. Now, the greater focus, though, of 29, beyond Hamilton's suggestion on how to actually handle the training of the militia, the greater focus of number 29 is Hamilton's insistence that the Anti-Federalists were wrong in claiming and being worried about federal control of militias potentially leading to our federal government using the military, not just for the defense of the country, but instead as an instrument of tyranny over the people of America. So instead of them using our militias to protect us from foreign influence and foreign enemies, they might use the militia against the people, against us. And we're kind of seeing that right now with our executive branch and our bureaucracy being weaponized against, concerned parents that are worried about indoctrinating propaganda curriculum in our schools. Did you guys see that story? Ugh. So, either way, back to this. Hamilton defends the Constitution in paper number 29 by saying that the federal government's control of state militias will actually make it so that we don't need a big standing army, which now we have. But he saw that as a good thing because many at the time saw a big standing army as a threat to their freedom and liberty. The Anti-Federalists saw this as a huge rabbit hole that could go pretty bad pretty quick, okay? Specifically when it came to this, what if the people we elect to federal office who are given control over our state militaries, our state militias that are supposed to serve our states because they were very focused on state power versus one big centralized federal government. They were worried that people would be elected to the federal government who would then have power to control the militaries, the state National Guard militias, and then use the military against the American citizens to enforce their laws. And so they were worried that, first of all, they'd be a tool for oppression and hurt people, but also that the federal government would start passing really bad laws and then literally just enforce the laws by using the military to make people comply. Now, this is a really slippery slope to go down when you think about it, because it does make sense. I totally understand their worries, especially when you understand the historical context, okay? I mean, put yourself in the place of 1787, where just a few years ago, you are living under the rule of the King of Britain, of King George. And what did King George do? Passed a bunch of unfair, oppressive, and tyrannical policies and taxes that the people didn't support, and they really weren't fair at all. I mean, it was very oppressive. But what did he do? He had the whole country, or the colonies, filled with his big army that would be there to make the people comply. And so that's what the Americans who are saying, we're a little worried about this concept of a very centralized government, having another military that's going to be all spread throughout our country and do the bidding of the federal government, when we literally just had to live under this, under the Redcoats and under Britain. It was like, once bitten, twice shy, a little gun shy, if you will. It's like dating. Once you get cheated on, you're a little worried next time, okay? You have trust issues. These guys had trust issues. That was a terrible comparison. Here I go. Don't you love this? We're all learning. Now, so this concern makes sense to me. I give them credit. Okay, I would be worried about this too if I were them. So the Anti-Federalists not only were worried about that, but they also voiced their concern that the federal government would use one state's militia to oppress the people of another state. But then Hamilton's argument as a Federalist was that moving militias between states would actually be beneficial, and it wouldn't be in an oppressive way. It would actually be a way for the federal government to help states that might be taking on more burdens during times of war. And so if one state is sending them out for some war, then we can fill their place and we can help them out, state friends, helping each other out by sharing resources and allocating the manpower to make sure people aren't suffering more than they need to and taking on huge burdens during times of war. So, in general, though, to the claims of the big worry, which was potential tyranny, potential use of the military as a tool of oppression, Hamilton said no. And this is my favorite argument from him. And you could see this two ways, because history shows that people will fall in line and say, hey, I was just following orders. You know what I mean? I mean, Nazi Germany, think of that. I was just following orders. There's guards in the CCP. I was just following orders. The people in the Soviet Union. I was just following orders when I sent them to the gulag and shot them. I don't know. So humans are pretty easily controlled and easily manipulated into thinking, hey, I got to do my job, okay? I'm just listening to whatever I'm told to do. Hamilton makes the case, and maybe it is true because we're Americans and we have this deep sense of independence in our souls and our bones. He says the men of the militia would never follow such tyrannical orders if it ever did happen from our federal government trying to use the militaries in the states as a weapon and a tool of oppression. He said they wouldn't follow these orders or be willing to do such a thing. And he also said, hey, the states still have the right to appoint the officers, so it will be another way to provide a layer of protection. What did he say? He said the states still have the right to appoint the officers, so it will be another layer of protection against tyranny. But he also said, in quite a hostile and sassy way, he gets criticized for this paper, by the way, for being a little aggressive. Okay, he's losing his patience, if you will. So in quite a hostile and sassy way, he says the Anti-Federalists are fear-mongering and that the militia won't be used as a tool of oppression because it will be made up of, quote, our sons, our brothers, our neighbors, our fellow citizens. Now, I just love when you get a good quote like that. But Hamilton got really criticized for his language here because part of the whole ratification debate was the greatness that came from these men being able to disagree in a respectful way. And then it was Hamilton who starts getting more and more sassy and more aggressive in his attacks, accusing his opponents of fear-mongering. And we see that all the time now in America, but that's because the radical leftists do fear-monger now, and they tell us we're going to die of climate change. So moving on from that, no. So now we know what the Federalists, Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, what they were saying, and now we know what the Anti-Federalists were worried about. I see both sides. Again, I wonder what you guys think. You know, if you got to pause the episode and debate it a little bit, if you got to think it, roll it around in your head a little bit, chew on it. Is that what they say? Is that what the young kids say these days? Or is that what the grandparents say? I don't know. Either way, we're moving on to number 2, the second topic, understanding the militia today. We're going to do a little breakdown on Title 32 versus Title 10. Now, I should preface this with my dad is formerly in the New York Army National Guard, so I know a little bit more about this than maybe the average Joe. So, the Constitution gave the federal government control of the militias. Let's address that. All right? The Constitution did it. By that, we mean the state militias. The state militias are also known as the National Guards of each state. The side note, my dad, he was actually in the National Guard for pretty much all my life, all right? All my life growing up, and now he is the auditor of the New York Army National Guard, so he sees a lot of crazy military spending, and I think that might be why I'm a conservative, honestly, because I saw how the military spends their money, and I was like, wow. That's not good. That makes me sad. But he's an auditor, and he's now a civilian. So when he goes in, he doesn't wear his uniform anymore. He wears suits and khakis and stuff. And I remember the day that he transitioned into civilian status, and we took him to the shop, and we got him all of his nice business clothes. And it was very cute because he no longer wore his military uniform. But that means he transitioned out of the Guard, and then he joined the U.S. Army Reserves out of Utah. And so, side note, now that I'm here in Arizona at the Turning Point USA studios, I can't wait to visit him next time he's at drill, because it's just a quick little flight up to Utah. So, he's in the U.S. Army Reserves, he's a colonel, and he served in Operation Iraqi Freedom. I'll get to that in a second. So, either way, I'm excited to see my dad. He was in the National Guard, so I got to understand from him the difference between Title 32 and Title 10, and it really plays into understanding the military today, specifically the militia. So, that being said, let me give you an idea of how this whole National Guard thing works to begin with, okay? Here's a good snippet that I grabbed from military.com, okay? I figured I'm not going to describe this the best way. Let's go to the military sources. So, military.com says, when mobilized or activated under Title 10 USC, which is United States Code, basically law, so Title 10 USC, you are directed by the President to report for active duty in an official capacity. You are being activated for federal active duty military service. When in federal service, Guard personnel typically participate in military operations and are entitled to the same pay, benefits, and legal protection as active military members. Activation under Title 32 USC means that your state's governor has been authorized or directed by the President to mobilize or activate the National Guard in your state. You perform on active duty under state control, but with pay and benefits provided by the federal government. So it's kind of like a combination sort of thing. If your Title 32 orders are for more than 30 days, you may be entitled to some of the same federal benefits as someone activated under Title 10 orders. Mobilization orders may come with different duties. Title 10 service can include overseas mobilization. Title 32 does not. Normally, Title 32 orders are for natural disasters, while Title 10 orders are for national defense. However, this isn't always the case. Guard members may also be ordered to active duty solely by command of their state's governor. This is known as state active duty or state call-up, and generally is in response to state-level disasters. When ordered to state active duty or Title 32 orders, Guard members may be granted the ability to act in a law enforcement capacity. This is prohibited when they are activated under Title 10 unless authorized by Congress. When activated in this manner, Guard members are state employees, not federal employees, and their pay and benefits are determined by state law. They are not eligible for federal benefits. So, if you summarize it in a very easy way, let's use my dad as an example. As a full-time employee for the New York Army National Guard, he is a state employee that is Title 32. That is his 9-to-5 job. He goes there all the time. But when the National Guard, my dad's unit, was activated to go serve overseas for the U.S. military on behalf of the United States, he was activated and it made him Title 10 to serve on behalf of the United States. So he was in New York State, New York Army National Guard, when he was sent overseas to serve the country, the greater country, he was changed to Title 10 and then paid as a federal employee. Does that make sense? Now, what this also mentioned, military.com mentioned the things like natural disasters and stuff. Another example for my dad, there's a lot of hurricanes in the last couple decades in New York history. And so whenever that happens, usually the National Guard is activated. My dad's always been activated. He was also activated for 9/11. So once 9/11, the towers were hit, all the National Guard was activated. My dad drove down to the city. We were about 3 hours away from the city. My parents still live up there in upstate New York. My dad, through the New York Army National Guard, was activated. He was not Title 10, he was Title 32 at the time. Now, the same thing happens with hurricanes. And so if something happens in your state, like a hurricane, and people are displaced, they need to be saved, you have to build up communities, you have to make sure resources get out, the National Guard gets activated by the governor. So what happens is the first responders, my dad's kind of explained it briefly to me. What happens is the first responders or whoever will initially respond to those issues, once they start to realize, we need some help, what they'll do is they'll contact the governor. The governor activates the National Guard to go to the site of the hurricane or the site of the problem. What can often happen is you realize, okay, we're going to need more resources than what we have as a state. And so the governor will, as Title 32, keeping them Title 32, he will ask FEMA for funds. And so FEMA, a national organization from our federal government, will reimburse a governor for the cost of solving their state problem. So there's ways around this. There's differences between what it means to be Title 10, which means you're going overseas, and differences between Title 32. But Title 32, you could be serving your state, and you can also now tie that to federal funds. So it's important for us to understand this stuff because as we become adults, as we become people where we might have natural disasters, we might have problems in our state in the future. And it's important for us as responsible citizens to understand where the funding for these emergency services comes from, specifically for our militias and for our first responder groups. And it's very interesting. I encourage you all to learn more about that. Let's move on, though, into the next aspect of this. The major anti-federalist worry over federal-controlled militias being a tool for oppression of the people. I want to give some examples of what the heck happened and how we got from... We'll talk about this with Congressman Gosar, but I want to paint the picture of the fact that what happens with good intentions in the beginning can slowly over time expand and expand and expand into this all-powerful bill that just becomes uncontrollable, and it could be used as a weapon of oppression or tyranny in the future. And that's the worry of the Anti-Federalists. So with that, you guys, we've been in some strange times as a country lately, right? Okay? Federalist Paper number 29 has been brought up more frequently than it usually is. And that's specifically because it's also connected to something called the Insurrection Act of 1807. I want to give you some history on that so that you can understand how we got from a point where our Anti-Federalists and Federalist founders were debating state and federal control over armed forces, and how we got to a point now where we repeatedly are concerned that our military is going to be politicized and weaponized against the people. Let's get into it, shall we? So let's start with a history of the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act of 1807, signed by Thomas Jefferson, is still a hot topic today, especially over the last year. I want to discuss it. Now, this I pulled from the History channel, history.com. It's one of my favorite resources, and I can't tell this story any better than they can. So we're just going to read off this because I want you guys to get straight source. The History Channel website says the Insurrection Act gives U.S. presidents the authority to deploy active duty military to maintain or restore peace in times of crisis. The Insurrection Act was invoked numerous times in the 20th century, most famously when Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to enforce the desegregation of public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. We all learned about that in school. But the origins of the Insurrection Act date back to more than 200 years to a bizarre chapter in American history when Aaron Burr plotted to raise an army and establish his own dynasty in either the Louisiana Territory or Mexico. So I'm a history nerd. I love this stuff, and that's why I wanted to include this in the episode. I don't know. The guys behind the camera are probably like, what is she talking about? I can like semi-see their faces. I like this story. I'm going to include it. Okay. History teacher Morgan. Professor Morgan, at your service. So the History Channel goes on. Do you like how I'm a history professor that just reads from the History Channel? I'm a great person. Here we go. In a letter sent on October 21st, 1806, Wilkinson, a man back then, he spills the details of the plot to Thomas Jefferson without mentioning Burr by name. But Jefferson had already grown concerned enough about Burr's strange activities that Jefferson had sent his own letter to the Secretary of State, James Madison, asking if the Constitution granted him authority to deploy the army to stop a rebellion. Because they're worried this guy's going to go start his own dynasty in like Mexico or the Louisiana Territory. Isn't it fascinating to see hear these stories of these guys? I mean, we hear about Madison. James Madison wrote a bunch of the Federalist Papers. Not only that, Thomas Jefferson, what a cool figure. And then this is also connected to Hamilton because Aaron Burr is the guy that literally killed Alexander Hamilton, and it ruined his political career. And so just a little backstory, he killed Alexander Hamilton, and it ruined his political career, so he basically was ostracized, and he said, I'm going to go build this dynasty and screw this government. So, in his reply to the letter, James Madison said, no, it does not. The Constitution does not grant you this authority. He said it does not appear that regular troops can be employed under any legal provision against insurrections, wrote Madison, but only against expeditions having foreign countries for the object. So only foreign situations, not domestic, not Americans starting their own insurrection. Both Jefferson and Madison were strict interpreters of the Constitution and would not dare exercise authority that wasn't explicitly written in the founding document, so they needed to convince Congress to give Jefferson that power. Can you freaking imagine if our politicians were still this strict and followed our Constitution? But no, the Joe Biden administration has literally ignored the constitutional process. How many times? 3 or 4 times in just how many months? Oh my goodness. Okay. And to that, they first needed proof of Burr's conspiracy. And so to get congressional approval of this new change, they needed proof that Burr was conspiring to start an insurrection. So, thanks to the letter that they got from Wilkinson, they used the letter as proof, and Jefferson issued a proclamation on November 27, 1806, that laid out the plot and enjoined all military officers, both state and federal, to be, quote, vigilant in searching out and bringing the condign punishment all persons engaged or concerned in such enterprise, in seizing and detaining, subject to the disposition of the law, all vessels, arms, military stores, and other means provided or providing for the same, and in general, in preventing the carrying on such expedition or enterprise by all lawful means within their power. So basically what Jefferson did there is put a bounty on Burr's head. And so within weeks, an Ohio militia seized boats that belonged to Burr's ragtag army and raided a private island on the Ohio River that served as a military encampment. So the guy had a private island and was like building a little army, thinking he was going to go against the United States. So Burr evaded capture, though, through all of this, and rumors continued to swirl that he was recruiting soldiers en route to the Louisiana Territory and soliciting help from Britain to establish his spin-off nation in the West. Isn't this fascinating? Jefferson still refused to deploy the standing U.S. Army to track down Burr and quash the rebellion once and for all, a written sense that was mocked by his political enemies, the Federalists. And so the Federalists thought that Jefferson should have had a little leeway and just said, I'm going to use the military anyways, even if the Constitution doesn't say that I can do it. Sketchy. What's going on here? You guys, I'm confused. People aren't perfect, so this is fascinating to see. Quote, Jefferson, to his credit, says, I'm not going to act unless the Constitution says I can act. The Federalists take a much broader view of the Constitution. If the Constitution doesn't outright condemn it, then that's okay. It's okay. But Jefferson stuck to his principles and in December 1806 asked Congress to pass a bill authorizing the employment of the land or naval forces of the U.S. in case of insurrection. This legislation, known as the Insurrection Act, would take another 3 months to become law. The bill was signed into law on March 3rd, 1807. Bada bing, bada boom. So now, what are we going to talk about next? We're going to say, okay, so when did this Insurrection Act actually get invoked? When has it been used before? And why are you even talking about it, Morgan? Well, if you paid attention to the news over the last year, then you will be aware of why I'm bringing it up. So, number one, the Insurrection Act has been amended several times since 1807, which made my job very difficult for this podcast because I really want to give you guys the facts, and it's hard when things keep changing all the time. So, in 1861, let's start there, Abraham Lincoln, and again, I'm a history nerd, so this is some good stuff, you guys. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln expanded the law to give him the legal basis to begin the Civil War, because without it, he couldn't send federal troops into a state without the governor's permission. So the change was made that allowed him to do so. Now watch the progression of this as time goes by. A limited piece of legislation continues to get altered and altered and altered until it's just pretty out of control, and it can be used for some pretty bad purposes in the future. And abused, used, and what the Anti-Federalists were worried about is as a tool of oppression. So, number 3, after the Civil War, it was amended to give the president the power to enforce the 14th Amendment and the agreements made for the Reconstruction in the South. Now remember, you guys, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and it granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and it guaranteed all citizens, quote, equal protection of the laws, end quote. So this authority is now in Title 10 of the USC. Remember, that is United States Code, basically law. And as I mentioned earlier regarding Title 10 versus Title 32, this is now in Title 10, this change. So, next thing though, it was invoked again. But when? For the Civil Rights era by President Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, our presidents, to deploy troops to enforce desegregation in the South when governors started defying orders. So a little state fight, state versus federal fight. Next, it was most recently invoked in 1992 by President George H.W. Bush after the governor of California, Peter Wilson, asked for help from the federal government to stop the crazy riots after the beating of Rodney King. And you guys, oh my gosh, if you have not looked into the LA riots, specifically, I mean, if you haven't gone and looked at them after what happened with June 2020 and all of the riots that happened after that, after the Black Lives Matter protesters and everything like that, and Antifa burning down, rioting, looting, all this stuff, you have got to look at the 1992 LA riots, and specifically look at those rooftop Koreans, because it's fascinating. All these rooftop Koreans are the Korean immigrants that came from communist Korea, settled in America, started their businesses, started protecting each other, and a ton of them, because you have to serve when you are a young man in Korea. All of the immigrants from Korea in LA that were having their stores looted and were being attacked and stuff, they all had military training back from when they were in Korea. And so they just started grabbing their own firearms. And the Koreans that owned gun stores were just handing out their... Ooh, I'm hitting the microphone because I love this story so much. I'm getting all excited. The Korean gun store owners were also just passing out the guns because they were like, hey, the police aren't going to protect us. They weren't protecting that community. And so the men of the community said, fine, we'll stand on rooftops and we will stop these gang members and these rioters and looters from ruining our community, affecting our women and hurting them and attacking them and taking our products and burning our stores down or looting from them. It's fascinating. So look up the rooftop Koreans, look at what they did to protect their communities when the law enforcement and when the government abandoned them, and just in general look at the 1992 riots. So, I digress. Moving on. Next, President George W. Bush. He considered expanding the Insurrection Act after Hurricane Katrina to place the region's National Guard under federal control, because it was a little chaotic there, if you remember. If you don't remember, another thing for you to educate yourself on. But he decided to not do it. And even though he decided to not do it, this is the thing, he actually, it was amended, the law was amended in 2006 anyways, and it achieved what he was potentially going to do. So, happened anyway. But most recently, Most recently, my friends, there was rumblings of a potential use of the Insurrection Act in late 2020, early 2021. And you guys all know what I'm talking about. But many accused President Trump at the time of potentially invoking the Insurrection Act. Those claims are false. What did happen, though, after, and what Congressman Paul Gosar is going to talk with me about next, is the use of our National Guard to, in a very political way, I would say that it was politicized, the way that they were used and the way that they were forced to monitor the Capitol for such an extended period of time. Our National Guard was brought into our nation's capital to police the U.S. Capitol grounds for an unseemly amount of time following the January 6 riots. It was strange, and it was a fairly political use of our military for a domestic issue. I'm excited to let you know now that it's time to talk to our wonderful guest, Congressman Paul Gosar. But first, let's read his bio. I want to give you guys a good understanding of just how great this guy really is and the fact that he's taking the time to talk with us and share his wisdom. Paul Gosar is serving his 6th term in Congress as the representative from Arizona's 4th Congressional District. First elected in 2010, he came to Congress with no prior political experience. He's a true statesman. I will tell you that. Paul believes that the Constitution is the cornerstone of our republic and also pursues policies that allow more for individual liberty and less government involvement. Dr. Gosar is focused on bringing jobs back to the district, fighting illegal immigration and securing the border, challenging the status quo, and holding Washington bureaucrats accountable, cutting wasteful government spending, and ensuring that he is representing the interests of his constituents. He has focused his legislative work on natural resources and government accountability. Both areas stem from his work on the House Committee on Natural Resources and the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. That's a big one. House Committee on Oversight and Reform is huge for us moving forward if we actually want to bring change to our country. Dr. Gosar is the Republican leader of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations and a member of the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Additionally, Dr. Gosar was elected to serve as the chairman of the Congressional Western Caucus for both the 115th and 116th Congresses. Dr. Gosar has managed to be extremely effective in a time of gridlock when few other bills were enacted. Rep. Gosar has introduced 16 bills that passed Congress, 24 other legislative initiatives became law, and 84 amendments passed the House of Representatives. Rep. Gosar was recognized in 2012 as one of the hardest working and most effective new members of Congress. Rep. Gosar raised the bar even higher during his 2nd term with 6 bills signed into law by the president, 12 other legislative efforts becoming law, and 24 of his amendments passing the House. As a result of this legislative success, Dr. Gosar was the most effective member of the 113th Congress. Dang! One of these legislative victories was the most important bill that passed Congress during this time frame, facilitating a land exchange that will allow for the creation of 3,700 new jobs and generate $60 billion for Arizona's economy. Before being elected to Congress in 2010, Dr. Gosar owned his own dental practice and was a small businessman in Flagstaff for 25 years. Whether Dr. Gosar is in Washington fighting for his constituents or back home working to find solutions to the problems facing the people of Arizona's 4th Congressional District, he remains committed to ushering in a new era of government that empowers individuals and reforms bureaucratic procedures that are stifling job creation. So with that, let's bring in Congressman Paul Gosar himself, and let's get the party started. Let's talk about Federalist Paper number 29 and what he's seeing behind the scenes in the United States Capitol. All right, here we go. So, Congressman Gosar, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Papers, powered by Turning Point USA. Everyone's very appreciative of you taking the time to do this. We have one first question for you. When you look back at the ratification debates, should we ratify the U.S. Constitution or not? Do you think you would have been on the side of the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists at the time?
I think I'd have been on the state Federalists. I'm a believer in we the people and the states and the power that we gave to the federal government, and the rest is to us and the sovereignty of the states. That's where I come down to. And when you look at our current situation, Congress has given up so much of their power and relinquished it to the executive branch, that the only way we're going to get back to is that federalist approach to the states' rights issue. So I'm very, very, very strong on that states' rights issue and the Federalist aspect. I'm very careful about what I do in my office in regards to the overreach. And one of the primary things that we looked at in our office was, where in the Constitution does it give us the power to do what we're doing? And where's this authorization? And if there's not something there, then we try to relinquish it back to the state for their jurisdiction.
Okay. So back then, during the ratification debate, you had the Anti-Federalists that were against forming the Union. Now that we've been able to see over the many centuries of America what we were able to achieve and, some of our shortcomings, do you think it was wise for us to have formed this union and ratified the Constitution?
I actually do, because look how long we've lasted. If we had a happy balance, if we had followed the Constitution, if we had followed the rule of law, it's timeless because of its application. It gives us that opportunity to sort those problems out and incentivize the debate. And that's what we're missing today, is the debate about these issues. When you debate something, the cream rises to the top. That's always the part that it was so spectacular about that. And so, but you have to follow it through with the rule of law, which is going to be something key in your conversation with me today, because the Constitution is really worthless if you don't follow it impeccably and follow it by the rule of law and apply the rule of law to everyone.
Okay, and that's exactly why I wanted to have you on. First of all, what you mentioned with oversight, with overreach of the government, trying to limit the size of our big government in Washington, D.C. and give power back to the states, you're in a very unique position. And this is why I know that you're a champion for this issue. What are you seeing on Capitol Hill, where our government is going so far away from the original intention of what our Constitution and our federal government were supposed to be? Do you see room for solutions? Is it just too big at this point to even solve it? What are your initial evaluations as a member of Congress, and what can you show us that you're seeing behind the scenes? Because everybody's curious at this point. Everybody's really worried out there in middle America.
Well, they should be, because I'm very concerned as well, because we're at that crossroads. We see the creep of socialism. We see an undefined, unprotected border. We see our adversaries like China and Russia, taking advantage of the situation that we find ourselves in. We have another side, the Democrats, who don't understand nor do they follow the guidances of the Constitution. They think it's a living, outdated document, and that's not appropriate. If you look at it, this is timeless. It has the solutions, because what it does is that it creates a process. And I've always been taught about good process builds good policy, builds good politics. It's very simple that way. And so where they try to utilize emotion and try to say, well, this was antiquated, this was some racist old white guy creating this, it really is, when you look at it, it was an attempt to get to perfection. Now, we've had to carve some edges here and there, but the process still stays the same. When you adhere to the process, you build good policy, you build good governance, and you reward the people that are governed by rewarding them by upholding their constitutional rights, their freedoms and liberties.
Okay. Now, so considering the processes, do you have any specific examples within the legislative branch and then also within the executive or judicial branches where we are no longer following the proper process?
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you, most people were watching the hearings today in regards to Merrick Garland.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that we have in here process is that it's conflict of interest. And Mike Johnson from Louisiana basically asked Mr. Garland, you're one of your children actually benefits greatly from the sale of the teachings of critical race theory. Haven't you disclosed, haven't you approached ethics? Because we don't want to have a conflict of interest. And he sided and quickly jumped side to side, never answering the question. So the oversight there, it's hollow. There's no follow through with that. And I tell people that look back at my time and government oversight. Where was the penalty paid for the implications of Fast and Furious, Benghazi, the IRS scandal against conservatives like us? How about the unmasking of American citizens? How about the Hillary Clinton emails? How about Russiagate, Ukrainegate, Obamagate, and Bidengate? Nobody paid the penalty. And then you look back at the process when the rule of law was applied to Mr. McCabe, he was able to get his pension back. That's not appropriate. And then look at our southern border. Here we got a federal interaction that is to protect the states, to protect the people, and it's wantonly open. Now states are having to look at the idea, is this an invasion? How do we protect this? How do we have jurisdiction over that entry in that aspect? So I think those are some fairly good ideas. And then one last one that is very pertinent is the rules of the Electoral College, calling into question the Electoral College. Is it just pomp and circumstance, or is it really a procedure to follow? I think it's a procedure to follow because it was never placed erroneously just to be pomp and circumstance. It had a process defining if we are a true democracy, we don't need that. But we are not. We are a republic, and there's checks and balances within the republic.
Okay, now something that I've heard. Have you heard of John Yoo before? He's a constitutional expert.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's wonderful. We just had him on a recent episode to talk about the incredibly expanded executive branch. We put it like that, put it nicely. Do you see that too? I mean, what he was saying is there's these large bills that get passed through Congress that really shouldn't be authorized. And they just basically give power to the executive branch to handle it because Congress doesn't want to. And so it hands over a ton of money to the executive branch to handle. Do you ever see what John Yoo proposed, which is ending these massive pieces of legislation that give power to the executive administration? Do you ever see that actually taking place? And what would that look like to make it happen?
It's got to. It's got to, because now what you're seeing, he's exactly right. We see these huge bills that everything's clinging and hanging onto it because we haven't done our due diligence. Now, when I first came to Congress, John Boehner, who was the speaker at the time, started down that pathway of having simple one-subject bills, and we had tons of votes. I loved tons of votes. I mean, we were, on the floor sometimes 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, at least once a week. So we took hundreds and thousands of votes. It was fun, and it was actually very, very great. But then it became, we're not going anywhere, so I'm just going to cut my own deal with President Obama. And that's not the way we ought to be doing it. And if you look at this current bill that's sitting out there, here we're going to subvert Article 1, Section 8 powers in immigration and give amnesty to over 26 million people. It's even greater than that because these are numbers that are antiquated back from the early 80s. The another thing is our Second Amendment right. So if you're accused of a felony, it allows the military to take away their Second Amendment rights for those that are under the military's authority. What gives? It's just an accusation. It's not you've not been convicted. These are all stuffed in here. Same thing with looking at the business licenses with China. Instead of making sure that's transparent and we know exactly who and why and how they're doing the business, we allow them to go through Portugal or through Grenada. And once they get a visa there, they automatically get a visa in the United States where they get an E1 or an E2 business visa, which are far superior and less oversight than what an EB5 was. So we're circumventing that all the time. And that's why I keep coming back to this saying, listen, but what activities belong to the state and to the people need to stay with the people. And we need to drive that back. And I think it's the crisis point that we're at today and electing strong leaders like governors like Ron DeSantis, attorney generals that are going to sue Secretary of States that are looking and reviving, making sure that if you cast a ballot, it's cast the right way and it's not going to be changed. And it's only those that are qualified to vote, that are legal to vote. So I think all of this plays into it, and we're at that crisis point. So we're either going to go down this experiment called socialism that has never turned out, Marxism, communism, or we're going to get back to the states' rights that go back and say, listen, this is state's jurisdiction. It's for the people. Let's bring it back to those people. But what it requires is the people to hold their elected officials accountable. Since I was elected to Congress, over 85% of the Congress has turned over. So, the turnover and term limits is actually what our founders wanted. The thing that we missed is holding them accountable. You said you were going to do what, when, how, and how did it involve us? How did it spare us? How did it get us back closer to the Constitution? I hope that helps.
No, it definitely does. And I don't know if you have a favorite copy of The Federalist, but I do. It's the one by Charles Kessler. And a quote that I often talk about on this podcast is he says that when the founders and Hamilton, Madison Jay, were writing the Federalist Papers, they were endorsing the Constitution, saying that it was a document, a political document, worth the rational and enduring consent of an enlightened public. And I know it's easier for me because I'm a civilian, I'm not in politics and stuff. It might be a little weird for a politician to say this, but I personally think that America is no longer enlightened. We lack a lot of basic information, and that's preventing us from being able to do things like hold our people accountable, hold our politicians accountable, but also understand our system of government, that we are not just subject to whatever Washington, D.C. tells us to do. We have a beautiful decentralized system that includes state power, local law enforcement, and so many different opportunities for us to fight back. Do you focus a lot on that in terms of the failures of the public education system? And more specifically, what I'm worried about is you see things like Washington, D.C.'s bureaucracy being weaponized against just active parents that are worried about curriculum in schools and trying to achieve school choice and non-indoctrination style curriculum for their kids. We're going to get into paper 29, which is about the Anti-Federalist paper. The Anti-Federalist advocates' worries about the federal government being weaponized against the people of America. Mm-hmm. And I see that not with the military, but I also want to talk about that with the FBI, the NSA going after people like Tucker Carlson. What are your thoughts on that? And are you guys doing anything behind the scenes in D.C. to help mitigate this?
Well, I think it goes back to an example that's very close to Arizona. Here we had some frankly, very poignant problems with an election process in Arizona. There was plenty of points of interest that didn't match up. There was fraud there. And so conducting an audit, which was given to the state has jurisdiction over those elections. So even to question it was radical. And yet, who turned it down? We had the governor who turned it down, the Secretary of State who turned it down. This wasn't a lose-lose situation. This is a win-win situation. This is where people need to say, wait a minute, I don't trust the post office. I don't trust that my ballot got put in here. So what this was an exercise in was to show, either reward the constituency, the citizen, that it did happen the right way, or if it didn't, is to reward them by saying we need to put a checks and balances into that process. That is key. But then you see the federal government trying to usurp that with these big monster bills that basically says, now we're going to federalize all elections. So we see this all the time. It's nonstop. And the only way I see us getting out of this is to put down the foot, hold people accountable, make it happen. And if you find wrongdoing, we have to take them to court and prosecute them for the failings and the atrocities against the citizens of the United States.
Okay. Now, when we talk about growing the number of people in Congress that will have the courage to do something like this, first of all, it takes a more enlightened public, people that are going to be aware and understand that this starts with them. But do you have people that all of the listeners and the watchers of this program should be starting to pay attention to and should be supporting and following along in this fight? Because we're interested in supporting them in the sense of just providing moral support even. Who should we be following for the future of this country? Is anybody leading the charge on Capitol Hill right now?
There are, and it's a group that I belong to. It's the Freedom Caucus, and freedom is part of our name for a reason. It's the one rare place where we actually have debate. In fact, one of the historian writers actually asked to come and watch our meeting, and she said she would not report on it, but she wanted to hear and see what happened. And after watching us, she said, it's truly getting back to the intent that I see and perceive by our framers.
Wow.
We take point, counterpoint. If we do this, what does it do to the Constitution? If we do this, how does it affect the state? How does it affect the rule of law? And so it's a vibrant group. So that when I come back from Arizona, the first night back, I can hardly wait for that educational toxicity of being, I don't think toxicity is the right name, but the feeding frenzy that I have, picking everybody else's brain about what they saw with the legislation pending us, or a movement, or a bill that's coming up, or a budget. or a Merrick Garland disposition. What should we ask? How should we ask it? Who should ask it? That's the fun part about this is the the glass has to be half full, not half empty. And when you see the approach, whether it be in natural resources, where myself and others are, then judiciary, where the application and holding accountable attorney generals, the courts, even the budgetary process, making sure that it starts in the House. All these things, I always say, keep it simple, keep it simple. Find people that you like, support them, give them cover. In today's world, you're called everything from a homophobe to a xenophobe to whatever it is, current aspects. And I've been called all of those.
Oh, me too. I'm apparently a white supremacist if you ask a bunch of leftists, so it happens.
I called out George Soros, so I guess that belongs here. But that's the point, is it takes courage, but think about it. You can't take all these riches home when you die with you. What you can do is leave something behind that our framers left behind. Ronald Reagan said this experiment called freedom isn't passed down through a bloodstream. It's passed down. Each generation's got to earn it, and we gain that trust from the next generation by passing it through. What was my experiences? Was I given the golden ladle? No, I had to fight for everything. I remember when I started my dental practice, I was sleeping on my couch. I was casting my own crowns at night, and then I'd go run to the apartment, take a shower, and run back to work. But that's the point, is an opportunity to exceed in my beliefs and my ideas and my opportunities. Yeah, there's always failure involved. There's not equal outcomes. It's an opportunity to better myself. And that's what we got to pass on. And Right now, I always say, when there's greatest chaos is the greatest opportunity for change. Hey, as the Blue Comedy Tour says, here's our sign.
I love that. And I've got to say, it makes my heart happy just to hear a politician talk about being excited for debate on Capitol Hill, specifically these debates between the House Freedom Caucus. I've got to say, how can I become a fly on the wall in one of those rooms? I really love it because you guys are reinvigorating what it means to be statesmen. That's what our founders intended, right? I mean, statesmen, right. People, average people, dentists, to serve our country and to serve the people. And I don't know if you know this, Congressman Dan Crenshaw was mentioning he was really enjoying one of the evaluations that I did of the Federalist Papers, which was the fact that the term responsibility kind of originated around the time of the ratification debate. It was never really used in the term of people, like a government should have responsibility for the people, and it came from respondeo and spondeo, its Latin origins. But when we think about it like that, it really does inspire me to know that there are people on Capitol Hill that have your mentality. So thank you for that. Now,
one of the things I want to say is that, Einstein, I know he's one of our, modern day people, but he made a comment. And I think it's very pertinent to this time. It's not that we have to think more, we have to think differently. And I think that's the case here, is that, you also want to keep it simple. You can talk above people's heads, but if you include them, you empower them to be part of the solution to the process. And it's just that simple, is get back to the process. It's going to build good policy because it's going to shine light on it. The cream is rising to the top, which is going to provide good politics. This is our time. This is our time to take advantage of that opportunity. We got people that are wondering why. Why aren't we passing these things? What does the filibuster do? Why is there regular order? Why do we go through the committee process? Why do we leave things to the states? The opportunity now is that juggle back and forth to get us back to the true intent of what the Federalist Papers deemed the background information to the Constitution. I think it's just that simple. But always keep it simple.
I agree. And I like what you said about it's about thinking differently. I often encourage people that are starting to pay more attention, people that say, oh, I don't do politics. I want them to rethink what it means to do politics. And by that, rethink education, rethink what it means to send your kid to public school. I think it's government school. Rethink education, rethink community, and rethink leadership. That I hope it inspires people to realize that they can take a stand. So thank you. I think you serve as a great inspiration for that. And kind of going off of that as well, So I mentioned the FBI is now saying they're going after these concerned parents. The NSA was recently exposed for looking at the private communications of conservative thought leaders like Tucker Carlson. And when you look throughout history, this is a classic. There's a checklist of what happens when a leftist regime gains power. And us at Turning Point USA, we are very aware of the fact that many aspects of this checklist are already checked or are currently being checked off or in the process. Now, what we're worried about is that things might get a little worse, and that's why it's important to look back in time at our original documents, at our founding concepts. And that's why I wanted to have you come on and talk about Federalist Paper number 29. So everybody knows, every episode we talk about a different paper. This one specifically was a debate where Hamilton, who wrote as Publius, is trying to make the case for why it would be important for the federal government to have control of state-level militias. And he said that it was safer for liberty. But the Anti-Federalists were worried that if the government had this much control, they would be able to weaponize the military not only to fight foreign forces, but potentially to be used as a tool of oppression against the American people. And I don't know how much we really saw that over the last few decades or few centuries of American history. But now this discussion of Federalist Paper 29 is back in the mainstream. I don't know if you've heard it too, but it's back into political conversational circles. And so I wanted to talk to you about that. What are your thoughts on this and just the first basic original thought that you have on this one?
Well, our founders were very worried about the military taking over and being used as a weapon, as you said. And that's why they wanted to have a civilian ahead of the military. That was very important to them. That was a part of the checks and balances. And you've seen it here recently in January 6th. After January 6th, we saw the National Guard being 25,000 of them isolating this area up here in Capitol Hill. You know, things did get out of the way, out of line for some, but for the most people, they were petitioning their government. They had a grievance. They wanted to air it out. They wanted to have clarity. They wanted to have a forensic audit. But we also see the lack thereof, where we see it not being utilized on our border. You know, we have no defined border. Now, there's great opportunities for our military. I look at, you know, emergencies, you know, disasters, fires, you know, and it should be used in our border application as well. Construction, all these different things can actually be welcome. But their whole point was that a civilian had to head that. That's why you see the governors on our National Guards, which are the state militias, by the way. But we also see the corruptness of the federal government of usurping that power by nationalizing those National Guard troops. So there's a happy balance, but we're straying on that right now. We're really straining that from both angles.
Interesting.
Not just the implementation of it, but the lack thereof, and allowing, like, for example, the invasion clause within a state having jurisdiction. 2 million people we're on track for, 400,000 possibly this month coming through our doors porously, and those are the ones we're catching. So it's probably twice that. That's an invasion when you're talking about 800,000 people coming across your borders illegally, not following the law. And they're diluting the law-abiding process. Because you have to remember that we bring in 1 million legal immigrants every year. So when you transpose that with 2 to 3 million illegals violating the law as their first step in this country, it dilutes the rule of law. It doesn't apply to everybody. And therefore, it applies to no one.
Okay. So knowing this, the two sides, overuse and not used enough, what are your solutions for each? What I love, we're going through crazy times, but honestly, this is sparking a new flame for people to understand federal and state power and vice versa. And so we're seeing that in Texas right now, where Governor Abbott is finally stepping up and potentially sending National Guard when the federal government fails to provide the resources. Is that the solution, when the federal government fails to step up and is playing woke politics? And then what do we do about the potential overuse? Because a lot of people are worried about that one.
That's exactly right. Well, and this is, you know, there's no bigger player that can take on the big bully called the federal government than the state.
Mm-hmm.
There's not.
Let's put that on a T-shirt. I love that quote.
Exactly. So we're going to have to use that balancing act. Okay. So I'm looking forward to those governors standing up, like Ron DeSantis. He's another good example. Maybe not just about border policy, but he's called it out, and he's wanted to have some of his border or his National Guard help out on the southern border in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas, particularly Texas and Arizona. But I mean, that's part of the key here is that it's going to take a challenge, and this is going to be remedied in the courts. That was the fundamental process. Is when there was a disagreement between the executive and the legislative boundaries. That was for the court to intercede and decide. But even that is broken down more. And we actually have a Supreme Court that ruled on Texas's abortion case. And then you have the Attorney General from the executive branch going, no, we're going to sue it again.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't you get the memo?
Now, does that just blow your mind? Did you ever expect that to happen in America?
No, because I was raised that, if you do the time, you got to do the crime. Or if you do the crime, you got to do the time. Sorry,
you're sounding like President Biden.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh, maybe I'm giving him an upward lift. I did, but that's the point. Is we got to push that envelope here. We're now victims, and people are tired of being victims. Mm-hmm. States are being victimized. So that's why you see the talk about saying, okay, let's let red states do what they want to and blue states do what they want to. The compact of interstate commerce, that compact, between protection of each individual states. All these are melting down because the Democrats or the progressives or the socialists, the Marxists, the communists are wanting big brother. They want government to say, this is what you do, this is how much you get, this is where you work, da 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 da. And we're saying quite the opposite. No, we want to be empowered to be the solution. We're not part of the federal government. We don't ask them for everything. They're going to tell us what the parameters are, but that's within our guidelines of freedoms, liberties, and those vestiges of God-given rights and powers. So I think we need to see governors step up. And that's where we, the people, have to hold the governor, attorney generals accountable as well. That's the checks and balances, saying, whoa, something's wrong here. We're overdoing it, or we're underdoing it. For example, the Summer of Love is another one example. Here we were supposed to have the Summer of Peaceful Demonstration, yet talk to the businesses in, Chicago and in Portland and Seattle and Minneapolis. They got a whole different story to tell on that regards. And then, anti-cop jurisdictions. And then the federalization. There's another one. The federalization of police departments, like in Ferguson, Missouri. Attorney General Eric Holder was very principled about making sure that they answered back to the federal government. That's where we got problems. That's why we have to use the enforcement of using governors pushing that militia, that National Guard aspect, to do the will of the people of that state. It's going to come in conflict with the federal government, but that's why we have to have the conflict, is to get restitution and get resolution of that problem. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. And thank you for providing this, because a lot of us want action items. We want to know what the heck to do. A lot of us feel hopeless, but it all can be fixed with knowledge and wisdom. And a lot of that can be passed down from people like you in your position. So I know you're a busy man. Thank you so much for taking the time. If we could wrap up our discussion, I'll let you go. But if you could provide, say you're talking to an average American that is so frustrated, they want to save this country from a potential downfall to leftism. What is your immediate action item that person can do listening right now?
The thing that I would tell them is get involved, whether it be a school board, whether it be an election issue, making sure there's accountability, a poll, volunteering for a poll judge at an election. The other thing is if they're a grandparent, I'm a parent. I can tell you, when you tell your kids something as a parent, it goes in one ear and out the other. Instill and rebuild the family. When a grandparent says something to a kid, it's like magic, and it does something else to it. It magically reconnects the circle of the family. Think of I look at all the things I've learned more from my failures than I have done my successes. And if I can park that on my grandkids, that's magic. And I look at my kids, things that I tried to teach them. Yeah, they got some of it. But it's nice when a grandparent or mom and dad or grandmother or my mom and dad told something to my son, and he'd come back and go, guess what grandma taught me? Well, how many times did I tell you that, Gaston? And then one in one ear and out the other. Let's get involved. Communities of interest. A lot of these kids, these young kids, millennials, have not had constitutional or history lessons. We should not feign from our history. Those people that do not learn from their history are doomed to repeat history. So there's the good and the bad. We take it. We're an experiment called a republic. And Benjamin Franklin and others said, if you can keep it. That's key here, but it requires involvement. And last but not least, there's a rule of law. It's not for some, it's for all. And we have to start demanding that, is that we have the rule of law enforced. And if you violate the law, I don't care if you're my friend, you're my neighbor. If you violate the law, you got to do the time for the crime.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. I've got to say I'm a little biased. I love promoting family and restoring American tradition, culture, heritage, and values. There's so much to be found there. There's so many positive things that can come from it. Thank you for mentioning that, and thank you for giving us action items.
And if you think about it, look at all these illegals that want to come to this country. There's a reason why.
Oh, there is. There is. Now, thank you so much. We really appreciate it for your time. And I'm sure it's late there. Are you in D.C.?
I'm in D.C.
So my gosh. Oh, then you need to go to bed.
I still got another hour and a half before I go to the gym.
Oh, my goodness. Well, you inspire us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great week. Thanks for working on our behalf.
You're welcome, and thanks for keeping this Constitution and this country in mind.
We're trying.
There you go.
Thanks. All right, you guys, that's a wrap on another episode of Freedom Papers. I hope you learned something. I hope you take this knowledge and go out into the world and spread this wisdom. Thank you to Congressman Gosar. I hope you guys go follow him. Not only that, but follow the Freedom Papers podcast Instagram. It's at Freedom Papers Podcast. We're going to be posting the highlights, the clips, and we're going to be building a community of people that want to better themselves and better their knowledge on our government, our system of government, our founding principles, our founding documents, and of course, the Great Ratification Debate. Thank you to Turning Point USA for sponsoring this great educational resource for everybody out there. I hear that teachers are playing this in their classrooms. I hear that homeschool parents are using this. And I also hear that a lot of Turning Point chapters are starting to meet and watch these episodes. So thank you guys for doing that. Thank you for sharing this information. And remember to follow Freedom Papers Podcast. Get your own copy of the Federalist Paper. This thing is $7, okay? It's like not even a Chipotle meal, okay? Buy your own copy. My favorite one is from Charles Kessler. There's a beautiful intro on it. And stay tuned for a new episode next week. Thank you so much for listening, and I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time.